Welcome everybody to our first ComAI lecture this semester with a very special guest, Axel Bruns. He's now the second time at our ComAI lecture, so he likes Semke and the ComAI research unit very much, which is also the reason why Axel is our first Mercator Fellow here at the ComAI research unit. So Axel will be here the next 2 months. You will have various chances to come in conversation with him. There will be also other opportunities at a PhD program. Axel will prepare one seminar and plenty of other opportunities. For all of you who are in the ComAI research unit, Axel will be also at our next 3 months meeting, and we will discuss one paper of him there. For everybody who does not know Axel Bruns yet, he's famous for what is gone here, Twitter. If I'm right, you co-edited the first book about Twitter, at least the first important book from my perspective. I have to check when it was, 2014, with the title Twitter and Society. Last book Axel has published was Are Filter Bubbles Real? Question mark. I think the question mark of this book title tells a lot. And at the moment of time, Axel is working on a book about public sphere, reimagining, rethinking public sphere in these times of AI, of communicative AI. Axel is a professor at the Digital Media Research Center at Queensland University, and beside that, chief investigator in the RRC Center of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. So this research center is the cooperation partner with our ComAI research unit. I guess your presentation has a lot to do with the book you're working on?
Yep.
So we are waiting for an inspiring talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. It's great to be back, in fact. Thank you for having me speak a second time. I guess the first one didn't go too badly then, which is good. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. And in fact, since you mentioned Twitter and Society, we've also, of course, give a shout out to Cornelius, who was also one of the editors of that book. So we're having a bit of a reunion, particularly when Katrin Weller joins us, I think, at some point in a few weeks as well. We'll have most of the editors here. When you say I'm working on a book, that may be an overstatement at this point. I have what Donald Trump would call concepts of a plan so far, but it will hopefully be a bit further developed by the time that I leave here in a couple of months' time. So before I get started properly, I'll do what we always do in Australia, which is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which I'm lucky enough to live and work when I'm in Australia. That's the Turrbal and the Yagara people as the First Nation owners of the lands where my university QUT now stands. Pay my respects to elders, laws, customs and creation spirits, and recognize that these unceded lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. We acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community. Now, in this talk today, there'll be a few concepts that I did discuss in this article from a few years back by now, 2023, in communication theory. If you're interested, there's the QR code there. Otherwise, you can, I'm sure, just Google it as well. And this is not the first time that I've talked about the public sphere and really thought through this idea of the public sphere. And by the way, since we're in Germany and Jürgen Habermas has just passed, this is certainly not a quick response to this. This is a topic that I've been coming back to over the years for probably the last 20 years or so. So this is certainly something that's been on my mind for quite a long time, this idea of the public sphere, or possibly what has replaced the public sphere in the sort of conventional model. And I'll say outright, I'm not really here to critique the Habermasian model of the public sphere so much as to think through what in fact we have at this point that takes the space that perhaps has been taken in the past by the public sphere. And really one of the first questions here is, when we say the public sphere, is there really a public sphere, the public sphere, a single unified thing that we can call a public sphere? Did that ever exist? Does it exist now? If we look, and this is where I do look to some of Habermas's writing, particularly here the article, which was actually his ICA keynote from 2006, where he describes it, I think, in a quite useful way, his idea of the public sphere as mediated political communication carried on by an elite on a virtual stage of mediated communication. So we've got mediated in there twice. And I think in some ways, and this is why I've got that image there, which probably in this audience doesn't need as much explanation as it does when I present this elsewhere in the world. What that reminds me of is maybe the sort of the public sphere that genuinely news broadcasts, particularly in Germany in the 60s, 70s, actually created. So a single daily, nightly news broadcast that literally at times had an audience well upwards of 50% of TV viewers, particularly before commercial television came along, certainly before even the second German public broadcaster came along. So this to me is perhaps the public sphere that I think of when I think of the sort of Habermasian public sphere, really genuinely mediated political communication carried on very much by an elite in those 15 minutes on a virtual stage of mediated communication. When you ask Midjourney for something like that, it looks like this. And this again is perhaps the sort of image that we might think of here. A stage, an arena of public communication where a select few can engage with each other and everyone else watches on. Now, I don't know that that really quite describes the reality that we live in anymore. Maybe it never entirely did, but certainly I think it doesn't now. And the image that I've come up with, or I came up with nearly 20 years ago now, looks something like this. And I had some help visualizing this, but this is sort of maybe something that approximates more what I think we actually are seeing today. Yes, there is still at the center the kind of the peak of the mainstream media, but we've also got this surrounded by a very large kind of array of various niche media platforms and spaces. We've got communities and publics, and maybe they're not even so public, but semi-public, much more private spaces, platformed spaces obviously as well, which brings its own complications. We've got in between connecting all of this everyday communication as well, that even is outside of these really truly public spaces. And what Habermas himself actually in that 2006 article called the wild flows of communication. So that sort of serendipitous exchange, which perhaps today happens, maybe even no longer happens on social media so much, since the decline of social media platforms, of certain social media platforms particularly, but those sort of wild flows of quite, not quite random, but certainly unpredictable forms of information flow and communication. That to me maybe represents more what we're actually currently encountering, but maybe even that is no longer enough to really describe the environment that we're in. And that's really what I want to think through with this as well, what that looks like. So if you ask me what my main problem or problems are with the public sphere, well, really the first one is the. I don't think, and I think it's really empirical, provable, that there is no longer a unified space of public communication in the way that the public sphere as a singular thing actually describes it. The second problem is the public, and you can probably guess where this is going, but the public part as well, because many of the spaces that we now communicate in are no longer entirely public, of course. They are at best semi-public, sometimes private, sometimes very large private groups, like the very large groups on WhatsApp, for instance, that arguably decided the last Indian election, and many others besides. So these are spaces that are no longer entirely public in the way that a public TV broadcast is, for instance, but are at various stages in between entirely private and entirely public. And that's a very complex and confusing mix as well, because some people do and some people don't have access to this. And yes, the third problem is the sphere, because again, this idea, and of course this isn't really in the Habermasian term Öffentlichkeit to begin with. The sphere got introduced with the translation into English, and that's a whole other story. But there isn't a kind of a single sphere anymore, but really what I'd argue is that we have a network of these spaces that may or may not be spheroid, but are interconnected and overlapping in many and varied ways. So what we're actually dealing with here is a network of these different spaces, not a simple sphere that we inhabit. So these are the three problems with the term the public sphere, I think, the public and sphere. But that's an easy thing to say. But if we take that and then go on from there, we've got people outside even looking on, wonderful. But if we go on from there, then where do we go? How do we describe what we're actually seeing? And so what I tried to do certainly in that article in Communication Theory is to think through kind of the fundamental building blocks, I guess, that the public sphere or whatever this is consists of. So let's think about those subsets of communicative formations, figurations, maybe that we might identify here. So below, and I don't want to really think of this too hierarchically, but let's take this for the moment. Below the idea of the public sphere, that's sort of the totality of all of these spaces. Some people have said there are public spheres, plural. So for instance, the political public sphere or the cultural public sphere. John Hartley and Alan McKee have written about the indigenous public sphere in Australia. We've also talked about platformed public spheres like the blogosphere back in the day, the Twitter sphere, the blue sky sphere, or I guess the atmosphere, seeing as it's the AT protocol. So these kinds of platformed spheres as well. Then other colleagues, Stuart Cunningham, Todd Gitlin, have written about public spherules or sphericals. They're sort of subsets, smaller kind of spaces that are perhaps centered around not quite the political, but specific political themes or cultural themes or whatever else it might be as well. So something at a level further on down. Maybe below that we've got issue publics. So that's where the publics idea comes in. That really center on specific issues, on topics, on events as well. And that because of this are perhaps more short-lived and kind of exist for as long as the event exists. There is an issue public perhaps right now around the Artemis mission around the moon. So these are the sorts of issue publics that might exist for a certain period of time. And then our colleague Jan Schmidt in Hamburg has written about personal publics, also in our book, Twitter and Society, by the way. So these are the publics that exist around people's individual personas, presences, particularly on social media platforms, around their accounts. And they consist of the people who follow that account and who that account is, and who that account follows. And they are certainly at a much more semi-private, semi-personal, semi-public, if not altogether private level as well. So these are some of the kind of concepts. Again, this might sound a bit like Russian dolls. I don't mean it in that quite hierarchical kind of way, because I think rather this is actually a network of these spaces. But these are all hopefully useful tools and useful terms that we can use to actually kind of break open this idea of the public sphere and distinguish it into more individualized spaces that overlap and engage with each other in certain ways. And so really ultimately what I'm getting towards is much more of a network of publics that I think exists here. And this is, again, just to have an illustration, this is what Midjourney gives you when you ask it for a network of publics. But in some ways that may not be such a bad illustration of this, because yes, there are larger and there are smaller ones. There's various interconnections between them. They're not all the same. They differ in many different ways, depending on what tools of communication they use, what platforms for communication they use. Of course, what that implies is also a certain amount of fragmentation. Clearly, these individual publics exist, so these individual spaces exist and are connected in various ways, but not always well connected, and information doesn't just equally flow across all of them, but rather we've got we've got barriers to communication between them as well. And that still doesn't mean, by the way, that filter bubbles and echo chambers exist, because there are strong connections between them as well. And we wouldn't have, for instance, the scourge of mis and disinformation if we're all nicely locked into our own filter bubbles, because then nothing would ever go viral and this would just not travel anywhere. That's a side point. So we've got fragmentation. As I say, we've also got platformization, because again, these spaces exist on many different platforms, on many different, and I don't just mean computational social media platforms, but many different ways in which people communicate, from what we're doing right now all the way through to WhatsApp messaging and whatever else. So we've got platformization. We've got, in fact, also, and this is again that sort of counterpoint to the filter bubble thesis, we've got hyperconnectivity actually between them. These are all connected in many different ways, in a way that makes it easy for information to travel quite quickly across these spaces and reach different audiences that might in fact engage with this information in very, very different ways as well. We certainly, and this is what enables this, we've got interoperability between these spaces, and that's partly enabled by various APIs and other tools, but partly also simply by people taking a URL from somewhere and posting it somewhere else. So it's the human-enabled interoperability as much as the technologically enabled interoperability that we see here. We have maybe in conflict with that to some extent, or certainly channeled to some extent, corporate enclosure as well. So obviously the major platform companies are very actively trying to keep as much of an audience on their platforms as opposed to their opponents, their competitors' platforms. And finally, thank you, Cory Doctorow, we've got initiatification as a result of this as well. Because of course, as these companies, as these corporate entities that run these platforms seek to extract value from them, they're shaping them not so much to suit their users, but to suit their shareholders. And that leads to all sorts of really bad decisions for how these platforms are run, how they're moderated, what functionality is available or is not available, and so on. So these are all the consequences just of thinking of all of this as a network of publics, I think. Now, putting that aside for a moment, we've then also got the challenge of thinking through what we mean actually by public, what a public is. And when you start looking at the literature about publics, you see that people have found all sorts of adjectives to put in front of the term public. And it's interesting to see what emerges when you look at this. So one of the kind of the leading descriptions and definitions of publics is by Warner, and that really centers largely around the public really being constituted by kind of a core text, a core thing that people come together around and engage with. So that's a kind of maybe a plain definition of a public. Of course, some of these publics are very influential. They might be hegemonic publics. They represent maybe the majority view in society. Then, of course, you've got subaltern counterpublics through Nancy Fraser as the kind of alternative to this, clearly, as the originally perhaps thought of as particularly as a progressive kind of counterpoint, but it might also be a very reactionary counterpoint by now that responds to the views of hegemonic publics, of majority culture. We have, and this is a term that Habermas himself actually uses as well, issue publics. So again, that's those fairly temporary publics that can form and dissolve very quickly around particular issues and events and topics as they emerge and then disappear again. My colleague Jean Burgess and I have written in a similar sort of way around ad hoc publics. So these again are publics that just emerge very quickly, particularly in the social media space, like Twitter as it was then, around something that just happens very quickly, often natural disasters, terrorist attacks, other sudden and unexpected events. And so ad hoc, we suddenly have people coming together to discuss what's going on, to make sense of what's going on perhaps. Increasingly, though, people have also looked at the dark side of publics. Many of these other ones were still in some ways positive or productive, but work by Larson and McHenry a few years ago talked about parasitic publics. These are in some ways also a counterpublic, but a counterpublic that is in itself trying to counteract the actions of another counterpublic, of a progressive counterpublic, by pushing overall public opinion further towards the reactionary and extremist side. They're the sorts of publics that are trying to shift the Overton window to make it easier to be bigoted and extremist. So this is another new term that's emerged recently. My former PhD student Anand Badola has written about phantasmagoric publics, borrowing from Walter Benjamin. These are publics that form not so much around an event or an issue that actually exists in the world, but around a belief, a fear, often a manufactured, a constructed concern that then drives them to come together and counteract that concern as well. So these are the people who, for instance, engage in conspiracy theories and respond to entirely false accusations of whatever the accusation might be, but then say, yes, we must act on this, we must do something about this, this is terrible. So this is the idea of phantasmagoric publics. And of course, many of these ultimately are also affective publics. Zizi Papakarisi has written a lot about this. So these are publics that are driven very strongly by emotive, affective language and communication, and are ultimately about a feeling, a vibe, rather than a more rational discussion. And that's not to say that rational discussion is always the yardstick by which we should measure everything, but some of these publics are very strongly driven by affect, obviously, rather than anything else. And there are many more. This is not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to kind of just talk through some of these as well to actually introduce some of these terms. Now, particularly also since this is a ComAI lecture, I want to say a little bit about the role of algorithms in all of this as well. So what I haven't got on this list are algorithmic publics, algorithmically shaped publics, perhaps. And I would broadly, I think we might maybe have a discussion about this later, but I would broadly maybe distinguish here between algorithmic publics that are shaped from above and algorithmic publics that are shaped from below. And what I mean by that is that, of course, we have algorithms that operate on platforms and shape the visibility of the posts that are being made, the accounts that are making those posts, the spaces that exist on any one platform. And imagine what that looks like for any platform that you're on. We have algorithms that engage in content moderation, in amplifying content, in recommending content to users. We have all of this, of course, again, very much highly platform specific, very much shaped around platforms. So, for instance, automated content moderation on Facebook, which is why you can't post pictures of Roman statues or probably rather Greek statues on Facebook, because it's going to be seen as nudity, which, yes, it is, but it's marble nudity. So those sorts of algorithms that often moderate out things that are perfectly fine to be there and leave things on that shouldn't be there. We have on whatever we call it now, Twitter, X, Shitter, we have shadow banning of accounts. Well, we had that really before Elon Musk took over as well to some extent, but certainly that some accounts are just ranked down, and of course Elon Musk's account is ranked up and put in front of everyone whether you want to or not. This is a form of algorithmic shaping, of course, of what you see. We've got recommendations on YouTube and a whole lot of research on whether or not the YouTube algorithm leads you down a rabbit hole if you just keep clicking on what it recommends. We have the For You feed on TikTok. We have a kind of a choose your own algorithm, various different forms of algorithms available on Blue Sky and so on. Again, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but these are all ways in which algorithms shape the experience of users in a way that I would call from above. But of course, that's not it by itself. We've also got algorithms from below. So we have algorithmic actors themselves, accounts within these communicative spaces. That again is highly platform specific, and of course that can mean things like automated agents, or literally accounts. Maybe some actions that you take on a platform simply trigger a response by the platform itself, by an account on the platform. Of course, we've got plenty of AI slop going around as well, which again is kind of algorithmic content from below in a sense. What that might look like is that back in the day on Twitter, we had plenty of what I'd call good bots, useful bots, interesting bots. Now, probably we've got plenty of bad bots and grief bots and whatever else. On Reddit, we've got bots that moderate subreddits. On Wikipedia, we've got plenty of bots that watch for edit wars, for instance, for repeated edits of the same content, and stop that and stop the accounts that are engaging in it. We've got whole AI slop accounts on Facebook that just pulls really terrible and offensive stuff as generated by AI constantly. And we've even got this thing, and I still don't know what to make of it, a whole platform that's purely for AI bots to talk to other AI bots, because we're really not wasting enough energy already. Yeah, where do you even start with that? I'm just going to leave that there for you to think about. But yeah, we have that as well, whatever that is. So we've got all of these things going on, and that's all ways in which obviously algorithmic intervention is also shaping the publics that we engage in. Now, I want to say a little bit here about the term public though as well, because I've sort of just jumped in and said, yeah, look, these are all publics and that's fine. And I don't know that that's quite accurate either. So sorry if I'm sort of just trying to dismantle a whole bunch of language that we're using, but I think we really need to go back also to some of the other terms that might often get thrown around kind of, at the same time as publics or just as an equivalent. And I think we need to become more clear about what we mean. So terms like community, like audience, yes, public, crowds, groups, there's a few others I'm sure that we could all think of as well. And they're not all the same. They don't all mean the same thing. And I think it's really important to recognize that and really come to a better understanding of what they do mean. And they're also, and again, this is not necessarily meant to be as a sort of hierarchical list, they have different consequences depending on what they are. So I want to quickly just go through a few of these terms just to give you an idea of what I think what they mean. Again, very happy to argue about this as well, because I don't think this is quite the final version of this either, but it's worth thinking about what we call what, because I think it is important to make our research clearer and more precise as we do this kind of work. So this is a group. This is a slightly heterogeneous group perhaps, but it's a group. Groups tend to be a small number of people, accounts, whatever, entities, that presumably have shared interests and values and aims. These people all have perhaps a shared interest, and it's clearly mountain climbing, and that have stable-ish relationships and pretty distinct rules in that group. That's what I understand as a group. And that also means that empirically, we can use that to find them in, let's say, digital trace data that we might be working with. So if they're a group and if they're a stable group, then they should have stable interconnections and interactions with each other that are repeated, that are frequent, that are strong. They presumably should have a shared language and markers of identity. They may be engaging with the same media objects, let's say Star Wars movies. They might be doing all of that. They might have similar practices and activity patterns in what they do as well. That's what I would understand as a group. And that's different from, for instance, a community. This is a community. It's larger than a group. It's not all the members, I'm sure, are known personally to each other. They have presumably still shared interests, as this group clearly have, but also those interests are to some extent contestable by members of the group. So they can contest what they're interested in, what their values are, what their aims are as a group, where they think this group should be going. And of course, because they're larger, it also implies that there's a more complex structure that has a center, someone, in this case a queen, but maybe a larger group at the center, a periphery that has leaders and followers that follows some sort of distribution by which some people are more central and more important and influential than others, for instance. So that means if we're seeing those in the data, this is what we should be seeing. Again, yes, repeated and stable interconnections and interactions and practices and all of that, but also carried out more by those people at the center, by the most influential leaders of these communities, rather than those at the peripheries, that may take kind of a long tail, Pareto type distribution, 1-9-90 rule might apply, where you've got 1% of leaders, 9% of highly active users, and 90% of kind of hangers-on, followers, lurkers even. So whatever the distribution, it's not so much about that, but there is a clear kind of long tail ultimately of activity here. As a community in the space where other communities exist, we would also expect them to have more interactions internally than externally. And that's where a tool like the EI index, which measures this, is quite useful to distinguish between these communities as well. And yes, broadly within that community, there's still a shared language, there's still shared identity markers, there's still shared media objects or other things they engage with, but no longer as strongly as there was with a group perhaps. Now we can contrast that then with a crowd. This is an example of a crowd. This is, of course, from the famous umbrella protest in Hong Kong. So that's, again, a much larger kind of dimension, a much larger number of participants, much less knowable, in this case very deliberately not knowable. That's why they've got the umbrellas, so the Chinese security cameras couldn't identify them. That's where that came from. But they are also to themselves much less knowable because they're all simply part of that crowd, but in some ways that crowd is kind of amorphous and much more of a mass. They are most likely to be more transient, more temporary, not persistent in where they are, whether that's online or offline, of course, in this case. And really none of what I'm talking about here is necessarily limited only to the online space. And yes, they have some shared interest, shared identity and shared interest, but other than the thing that they, in this case, protest about, there may not be much that they ultimately have in common. And if they talk to each other, they might find that out as well. So again, looking at that then, well, of course, they're larger, so they might be easier to find in a sense. They might be very active for a much more limited period of time around particular issues. They, yes, have similar patterns of activity, but not actually that much interaction. So it's actually maybe more about parallel activities than really engagement with each other. They certainly have some shared language and identity markers and so on, but probably only to that one specific issue. So the part that's shared among them might be much smaller in dimension than the things that actually divide them if they were talking about that, which they, at the time that they are a crowd, perhaps aren't. And then coming back to public, now this might look like another crowd, and to some extent there is a kind of a similarity here, but in this particular case too, they are more centered around that shared interest, that issue, that shared text possibly, that really drives them. In the case of Black Lives Matters, as horrible as it might be to describe this as a text, but the killing of George Floyd and the footage of the killing of George Floyd is to some extent the shared text that a movement like Black Lives Matter galvanized around. Not the only one certainly, but one of the key texts that they gathered around ultimately at that point. Now they can again come together and dissolve quite rapidly. There can be ad hoc publics. They're certainly around an issue, so there can be issue publics. But there's often a lot more communication involved, a lot more mutual awareness involved than there is perhaps with a crowd. They might develop actually shared values, maybe even develop at the core into more of a community. Probably not everyone who's involved in the public does that, but there might be a central core that forms and becomes a community of this. And of course, they're then also, through that, more able to organize in support of that common goal than perhaps a single crowd can be. So that's where I would draw the distinction between a crowd and a community. And again, that means that yes, we should be able to find them relatively easily in data, for instance, because of the size. We should be able to see the activity that they're engaging in very, very easily because there is a lot of it. But also a lot more similarity in not just the activity, but also the levels of interaction between particularly the core participants. And yeah, shared language, identity markers, media objects, maybe that they even create as part of that process of becoming a public and as maybe the center of that public actually turning into a community as well. So that then turns into longer term structures and leadership. And then I think finally for this set of terms, there's also the audience that again is in the same way as a public perhaps centered around the shared media text, but much more dispersed and much more literally focused on that text as an audience of the concept might be. So much more dispersed, far less known to each other, particularly of course if they're simply distributed and not physically in the same space. And therefore not really likely to share any values other than that central common interest that they have in whatever the central text is, the central performer, for instance, is. And therefore, other than maybe applauding together, there's not much that they can do in order to act together. This is much more of a hub and spoke arrangement where there is that central text and they all hang on that, but there is no cross communication amongst them. So it's the text ultimately that unifies them, that enables us to find them. It's the it's that defines them, that we can find them through. They can be very large. They can also be quite niche. So the size does not necessarily make much of a distinction here. And really what they're doing is they're observing rather than actively contributing. And that's a really important distinction, I think, even with a crowd, which tends to be a bit more active. And therefore, because they're not really visible to each other, they remain unaware of each other. So an audience for, I guess, particularly from a digital trace data perspective, is harder to identify because they don't necessarily leave traces other than the viewing numbers perhaps that you may be able to see on some platforms. Now, I've talked a lot at you. I've talked a lot about these different concepts, and obviously there's a question here of, well, why does any of this matter? Why do we care? Why go through all that trouble of defining these different types of entities, of thinking about how they might hang together, how they connect together, and so on? The simple answer is that words matter, that concepts matter. I don't know about you, but I tend to get, maybe more upset and annoyed than I should when I see the next, and I'm sorry to say, particularly computer science article that talks about communities when they mean clusters. When they've just found a cluster in a network and they say, well, there's a community. No, it's not. There's a cluster of people or whatever accounts that are connected in some way, but you still haven't proven that there is an actual community here. They might just be randomly connected to each other. And that matters, because if we are simply talking about communities as accounts that somehow connect to each other in a social media context or in whatever other context you can think of, then that cheapens the term community. It doesn't help us understand how communities work. It just brushes away a lot of the knowledge from cultural studies, media and communication research and other fields that have gone much deeper into, and ethnography and anthropology, that have gone much deeper into understanding how communities actually work and operate. So these terms matter, and the distinctions between these terms matter. The words that we use are used to make these quite intangible concepts ultimately intelligible to us, usable to us, operationalizable to us for various purposes, for research purposes and other purposes. So we need to agree on a common language for these terms, at least amongst ourselves. I'm not sure we can ever get through to the computer scientists, frankly, but that's too bad for them. But at least amongst ourselves, I think we need to have that common language and really make sure that when we mean public, we're saying public, we're not saying community. When we mean cluster, we don't say community, and so on. So that we use these terms in the way that we should, in a way that is more systematic and doesn't add to the confusion that's already there. So that's the first point. Of course, particularly in the present environment where we have so many concerns about how communities and publics, and particularly parasitic publics and other problematic formations work and act and influence public debate. It's really important to have that really accurate kind of language in order to diagnose where the issues are, where the problems are, and what the dynamics of them are, whether that's in social media spaces and other digital media spaces or offline as well. This is not in any way limited to the online space. And of course, particularly when we then make recommendations for practical action by community groups, civic groups more generally, by platforms themselves or other entities that perhaps have a business stake in this, by policymakers, regulators, government bodies. Again, it's really important to use precise language in doing this, I think. And that's why I'm really, for myself, I want to spend some time actually really working through these terms to make sure we've got a useful vocabulary. And I'm not saying I'm the only one doing this, obviously, or the first one to do it, but I think it's time to really look very closely at these terms, because so often in public debate, people are using the term community or whatever when really what they're looking at is something entirely different. So that's I think why that's important. And in terms of the metaphors and the images that they evoke, it makes a difference, coming back to public sphere, it makes a difference whether we think of a public sphere as something like this, which is a sort of really old-fashioned thing, where everyone's sort of sitting around the same, I don't know what that is, Lumiere, I guess, let's say, and is seeing the same thing, and you genuinely have a single unified public sphere in which things happen and to which you are an audience, I guess, in this particular case. Whether we think of the public sphere as something like this sort of fragmented space of all of these individual boxes that people are in which they have no connection with the outside world and with each other. That's, I think, the sort of the echo chamber and filter bubble metaphor, which again has caused a lot of damage already and is continuing to do so, unfortunately. Or if we think of a public sphere as something much more like this, a complex network of these spaces that are interconnected and hyperconnected even with each other in various ways, and which you can enter and traverse in a number of ways, not entirely freely, because again, these are also constrained by platforms and algorithms and everything else, and by our fellow human beings for that matter. But these three models, these three visions are very different and have very different consequences. It's important to distinguish between them. We need, I think, to come to a better understanding of really what the current kind of communicative environment that we live in more resembles for most of us. So that's, I think, why all of that's important. And ultimately, I come back to these sorts of questions. If there isn't that one public sphere, that unified the public sphere anymore, then what does that mean for society, for democracy, for societal cohesion? How do we ensure that everyone is well informed about what's going on in the world? And of course, that also enables them to exercise their rights and obligations in democracies, or enables them to fight for democratic rights in places that aren't democracies anymore. And also, if this kind of network of whatever we call these communicative formations, figurations, whatever they are, if that in itself is suffused with these algorithmic actors that are, themselves not always detectable as algorithmic actors, but also appear very much as other human beings, then how do we help our fellow citizens navigate that space? How do we help them make sense of what it is that they see there, whether or not they can trust that or should engage with that or whatever, and who is behind the maybe human seeing but maybe not human being accounts that they encounter in these spaces. So all of these, I think, are important questions that we need to address, and I think we can only properly address them if we come to a better understanding of what this space is that we operate in and how we can describe it. And that's really ultimately what, I guess, for me is sort of the driving agenda at this point, to really get to a better understanding of what that looks like. So I might leave it there, and hopefully we've got some time for questions. Thank you.